You are standing in a cave 40,000 years ago, and there is nothing to do. No screen, no task, no deadline, just firelight, cold stone, and your own mind, which is already starting to itch. That itch is older than agriculture, older than language, maybe older than your own species, and it built almost everything you now call culture. It is not a flaw in the human brain. It is a survival system. Now let us actually think about what that means. Boredom feels like nothing happening, but inside your skull, something is very much happening. When you sit through a dull stretch of time, your attention network, the part of your brain that filters out distractions and locks onto what matters, starts to lose its grip. At the same time, a separate system called the executive control network, the part that keeps you focused on a task even when the task is not interesting, begins to run out of fuel. As those two systems fade, a third network wakes up. It is called the default mode network, and it activates whenever you stop paying attention to the outside world and start paying attention to your own thoughts. This is the network responsible for daydreaming, for mental wandering, for the strange places your mind goes when you are standing in a line or staring at a wall. Alongside this, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your brain called the amygdala, which normally handles threat and emotion, starts tagging the empty moment as unpleasant, and a region just behind your forehead called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which helps you weigh options and make decisions, starts nudging you toward literally anything else. Put simply, boredom is your brain refusing to sit still in a moment that offers it nothing. It is discomfort with a purpose. That purpose is to get you moving towards something new. This is where the deeper explanation comes in, and it's not a modern one. For most of human history, staying alert to new information was not a luxury, it was survival. A brain that could tolerate endless repetition, the same berries, the same watering hole, the same unchanging routine, was a brain that missed opportunities and missed danger. Predictable patterns can be exploited by predators. Unchanging food sources run out. A restless mind that gets uncomfortable with sameness is a mind that goes looking for the next food source before the old one is gone, that notices the unfamiliar sound in the grass, that experiments with a new tool instead of settling for the old one. Boredom, in other words, is not the opposite of survival instinct. It is one of its main engines. It punishes stagnation and rewards curiosity. Every early human who felt that itch and acted on it was quietly outcompeting every early human who did not. But here's where most assumptions about early life get something badly wrong. The common picture of early humans is a species locked in constant grinding struggle. Every waking hour spent hunting, gathering, or fighting to survive, with no time left over for anything resembling leisure. The archaeological and anthropological evidence tells a very different story. Studies of hunter-gatherer societies, both from the deep past and from groups still living similar lifestyles into the modern era, showed that securing enough food and shelter often took a surprisingly small portion of the day. Once basic needs were met, there were long stretches of unstructured time left over. Anthropologists studying this pattern have called it the original affluent society, a phrase that sounds strange until you understand what it means. It doesn't mean ancient humans had more possessions. It means they often had more free time relative to their needs than people in many later, more complex societies. Time was not always the scarce resource. Attention was. So now put both of these together. On one side, you have a brain engineered by evolution to feel real discomfort in the absence of novelty, a system that treats an empty afternoon almost like a low-grade emergency. On the other side, you have actual measurable stretches of downtime. Hours around the fire after the hunting and gathering was done, quiet moments waiting for weather to pass, long nights before sleep. Combine an itch that demands stimulation with hours that offer none by default, and you get pressure. That pressure had to go somewhere. It didn't vanish. It got engineered into solutions. The ancient human answer to boredom was not to endure it passively. It was to invent things that could reliably produce novelty on demand. That invention process, repeated across tens of thousands of years and countless separate human groups, is where music, art, storytelling, and games come from. None of it was originally decoration. All of it was a direct answer to a biological problem. Before any of that gets built, though, there's a simpler, cheaper layer of boredom solving that costs nothing and requires no tools at all. Your body is always available, and touch is one of the oldest ways primates, humans included, have managed restless downtime together. Grooming another person, or being groomed, releases the same soothing brain chemistry that a good conversation does. And long before humans had complex spoken language, sitting together and grooming was almost certainly filling the exact function that idle small talk fills now. It kept hands and attention occupied. It strengthened trust between individuals, and it made the empty stretch of an afternoon feel purposeful instead of wasted. Alongside this, you get the earliest evidence of deliberate self-decoration. Shell beads found at sites in South Africa and the Middle East dating back 75,000 years or more, and there's no way to eat a shell bead or use it as a weapon. Its only function is expression and adornment, which means someone sat with those shells during a quiet stretch of time and turned raw material into a personal statement. Thousands of years later, humans were doing the same thing to their own skin. The naturally preserved body of a man who died in the Alps around 5,300 years ago, known today as Ötzi, carries dozens of tattooed lines and dots, among the oldest confirmed tattoos on a human body ever found. Whatever medical or symbolic purpose those marks served, the act of making them, sitting still while someone works a pattern into your skin with soot and a sharp point, is itself a slow, deliberate, attention-consuming ritual. Boredom doesn't always need a grand invention. Sometimes it just needs your own body as the canvas. Children solved the same problem in a way that did double duty. Archaeologists working in ancient Egypt and in the cities of the Indus Valley civilization have recovered small clay and wooden figures shaped like animals and people, some with wheels attached, some clearly built to spin, alongside miniature carved tops that would have spun on a stone floor exactly the way a modern top spins on a table. None of these objects fed anyone or protected anyone from weather. They existed purely to occupy a restless young mind, but a child spinning a top or walking a wheeled animal toy across the ground is not simply killing time. They're quietly rehearsing balance, cause and effect, and fine motor control they'll need for the rest of their life. A great deal of what looks like pure entertainment in the archaeological record turns out to be training in disguise, and that overlap is not an accident. Play that also builds a skill is more likely to be repeated, and behavior that gets repeated is behavior that sticks around across generations. Start with sound. In caves in southwestern Germany, archaeologists have recovered fragments of flutes carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory, dated to somewhere between 35,000 and 43,000 years ago. One, found at a site called Holy Fels, was carved from the wing bone of a griffin wedger, a bone that is naturally hollow and therefore perfect for the job. It has 5 carefully spaced finger holes and a mouthpiece shaped with real precision. Not a crude first attempt, but the product of a craftsman who had clearly made instruments before. Other flutes from a nearby cave called Gießenkloster, carved from mammoth ivory, required an even harder process, splitting the tusk, hollowing both halves, and rejoining them before shaping the outside. That's not the work of people with no spare time and no patience for anything beyond survival. That's the work of people who had already solved enough of their survival problems to spend real effort on making sound. Music does something boredom can't easily argue with. It creates pattern and variation at the same time. Familiar enough to follow, different enough to hold attention, and it does this without requiring a single word of shared language. It also does something deeply social. Rhythmic, coordinated sound synchronizes people, and synchronized people bond faster than people who simply sit near each other in silence. Sound rarely stayed still on its own. Wherever you find evidence of rhythm, you also find evidence, direct or implied, of movement to match it. Moving in time with other people, stamping, swaying, clapping, does something that listening alone cannot. It synchronizes not just attention, but actual physiology, heart rate and breathing beginning to fall into step across a group. And that kind of physical synchrony reliably produces a flood of good-feel brain chemistry, including natural pain-relieving compounds called endorphins and a bonding hormone called oxytocin. A bored, restless body wants to move, and shared rhythmic movement turns that restlessness into something that strengthens the group instead of just draining nervous energy. Long before there were spectators and performers, dance most likely started this way, everyone moving together because standing still while restless was harder than moving. Then there's image. In caves like Chauvet and Lascaux in what is now France, and on carved pieces of ochre found at Blombos Cave in South Africa, dating back 70,000 years or more, early humans left behind detailed animal figures, hand outlines, and deliberate geometric patterns. Some of this had ritual or spiritual meaning we can only partially reconstruct. But underneath any ceremonial purpose sits a simpler, more universal one. Making a mark is one of the fastest ways to convert an empty, understimulating moment into an engaged one. Anyone who has ever doodled during a long meeting already understands this instinct. It requires almost no tools, it produces an immediate result you can look at, and it turns idle hands into occupied ones. The scale and skill in some of this ancient art shows it went far beyond idle doodling into serious craft. But the base impulse, filling empty time and empty space with intentional marks, is the same impulse a bored person feels today reaching for a pen. Now look at structured play. By the time you get to ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, roughly 4 to 5,000 years ago, boredom solving turned into genuine engineering. The Egyptian game Senet, one of the oldest board games ever discovered, used a grid of squares and a race to the finish, almost certainly tied to ideas about the journey through the afterlife, which shows how thoroughly a simple pastime could get woven into a culture's biggest questions. In Mesopotamia, a nearly identical race game, now called the royal game of used pyramid-shaped dice, and its rules survive on a clay tablet written by a Babylonian astronomer roughly 2,000 years after the game itself was already old. Across both regions, small carved animal knuckle bones were used as improvised dice long before purpose-built cubes existed, and archaeologists have found them buried alongside sets of plain tokens that look a great deal like markers used for informal betting, with instructions on some surviving tablets that describe placing a token in a shared pot when a piece lands badly and taking one out when it lands well. In other words, people were not just filling time with these games. They were adding risk and reward on top of the basic pastime, because a small stake makes an already engaging activity even harder to look away from. These were not children's toys tucked away in a corner either. Boards for these games have been buried with kings, stored in tombs, carried across trade routes stretching from Egypt to Iran to Cyprus. A pastime invented to answer a private, personal itch had scaled up into something valuable enough to bury with royalty. Language itself became a toy. Long oral traditions across many ancient cultures preserve riddles, tongue twisters, and short wordplay puzzles passed down for generations. And their survival tells you something important. A riddle forces the listener to actively search their own memory and imagination for an answer, instead of passively absorbing information, which makes it a compact, portable, tool-free way to occupy an idle mind during a walk, a wait, or a watch. It costs nothing to carry, it can be reused endlessly with slightly different phrasing, and it turns two people standing around with nothing to do into two people locked in a small mental contest. Wordplay like this likely served as both entertainment and as an early form of teaching, sharpening memory and quick thinking in a way that felt like a game rather than a lesson. Storytelling deserves its own moment here, because it may be the oldest and most efficient boredom solution of all, and it required no tools whatsoever. Long before writing existed, oral tradition let a single voice hold an entire group's attention for an evening, turning a shared fire into a shared experience. A story does exactly what your default mode network is already trying to do on its own: wander into imagined scenarios, test out cause and effect, rehearse situations that have not happened yet. Except now it is guided, shared, and repeatable. Myths explaining where the world came from, why animals behave the way they do, why the stars sit where they sit, gave a wandering mind somewhere structured to wander to, together, at the same time, which is a very different experience than wandering alone. So now put both of these together again, the private coping mechanisms and the shared ones. Doodling, daydreaming, fidgeting with a tool, quietly humming to yourself, these are solitary answers to boredom, and they work, but they only serve one mind at a time. Music, storytelling, dance, and games are social answers, and they do something a solitary fix cannot. They multiply the effect across an entire group at once, and in doing so, they strengthen the bonds between the people experiencing them together. Researchers studying the timing of these European cave sites have pointed out that groups of early modern humans arriving in Europa, the same populations leaving behind flutes and cave paintings, appear to have outcompeted and eventually replaced Neanderthal populations, who left far less evidence of this kind of expressive culture. Nobody claims boredom solving alone won that competition, but a species that had figured out how to convert empty time into group bonding, shared meaning, and transmitted knowledge had a real edge over one that hadn't. Because those shared activities did more than pass the hours. They taught skills, they reinforced group identity, they built trust between people who might need to rely on each other in a crisis, and they let information move between minds without needing every single person to independently discover it. The private fixes kept individuals from cracking under empty time. The social fixes turned that same empty time into the foundation of civilization itself. Ritual, religion, organized recreation, competitive gambling, structured art, all of it descends from the same starting point, a mind that couldn't tolerate nothing, and a species clever enough to keep manufacturing something. None of this required the ancient humans doing it to understand any of the neuroscience behind it. They were not naming default mode networks or executive control systems. They only knew the feeling, the restless, itchy discomfort of a quiet evening with nothing to occupy the mind. And they built their way out of it, one flute, one painting, one carved gaming board, one story at a time. Every solution they landed on shares the same fingerprint. It creates novelty on demand, it rewards attention with something worth attending to, and it usually pulls other people into the experience because shared novelty beats solitary novelty almost every time. You are not so different from the person sitting in that cave. The itch you feel reaching for your phone during a dull meeting is the same itch that carved holes into a vulture bone 40,000 years ago. Boredom did not get defeated by modern technology. Modern technology is just the newest chapter in a project ancient humans started the moment they had a spare hour and a mind that refused to waste it.